In 1969, David sits down with his kids to sketch their portraits when an unexpected interruption occurs. Jessica, his wife, reminds them it's time to leave. The family has a delightful time at the theater. However, as they exit, a couple recognizes David from the news and is astonished by how lifelike he appears. They even touch his hand, marveling at how he seems so lifelike up there. David wants to explain the process to them, but Jessica cuts them off, and they head home. Outside their house, Jessica spots a peculiar van parked nearby but chooses to disregard it for now. Later, after tucking their children into bed, they enjoy some intimate dancing together. Things start to heat up as David's hands become more adventurous, bringing Jessica to her peak of passion. Just then, David's wristwatch begins beeping, and he announces he must depart. Meanwhile, Cliff leads a quieter life with his wife Lana and their son Henry. They've recently moved to the countryside to escape the hustle and bustle, but Henry remains distant and unresponsive towards Cliff. Their existence is rather uneventful, with Cliff spending his days on chores and only engaging in brief conversations with Lana, usually about dinner. Lana appears visibly bored, maybe even depressed. While they deal with the dinner dishes, Cliff's wristwatch also beeps, signaling he must return to work. At that very moment, both Cliff and David rush to a concealed room in their respective houses. They settle into special chairs and input passwords, transporting themselves into a space station. It turns out they're partway through a 6-year deep space mission. To maintain a connection with their families, robot copies of themselves, known as replicas, reside on Earth. The astronauts spend their leisure time with their consciousness linked to these robots, only awakening when their attention is required on the station or for equipment and body maintenance. Today, they've been summoned back due to a warning. Cliff removes all personal items, including the tag linking him to his replica, dons his spacesuit, and ventures outside for maintenance work. Fortunately, the situation isn't dire, and with David providing guidance over the communication system, Cliff finishes his task in a matter of minutes. After a brief exchange, they return to their regular lives on Earth. Cliff heads back, where Lana is already in bed, engrossed in a book. She suggests throwing a party for their new neighbors, eager to get better acquainted with them. Cliff hesitates and promises to consider it, though Lana senses he'll likely decline. Meanwhile, David is abruptly awakened by noises from downstairs. Armed with a baseball bat, he cautiously makes his way to the living room. To his shock, he discovers a group of extremist activists reminiscent of Charlie Manson's cult. Their leader, Kappa, deems David an abomination and claims their mission is ordained by God. They insist on seeing the machine and disregard David's pleas to leave. Despite his attempts to defend himself, they overpower him, pinning him against the counter. Kappa severs David's arm with a knife, revealing David's lack of blood, which unnerves Kappa. He proclaims David unnatural and proceeds to strike him on the head with a hammer. Suddenly, David awakens on the space station in a state of panic. He urgently resets the machine and reconnects with his robot, only to find himself restrained on a couch. The gang has captured his family, and Jessica demonstrates blood on her hand as proof of their humanity. However, Kappa remains steadfast in his belief that the family, despite being real people, are sinners for associating with an abomination. David is forced to witness the gruesome events as the fanatics murder his family, splatter blood across the walls, and ignite a fire to incinerate both the bodies and the replica itself. Meanwhile, at Cliff's residence, he receives a distressing call in the middle of the night regarding David's fate. He returns to the spaceship, where he finds his devastated friend. David, overwhelmed with grief, rebuffs Cliff's attempts to console him and shouts at him to leave. Cliff reconnects with Earth and relays the horrific events to Lana. However, she's already seen the news in the morning paper. Cliff contacted ground control, but he was advised to give David space. He's also learned that the criminals turned themselves in to the police. Cliff declined offers for security at their home, fearing they wouldn't be found there. He's worried about David's isolation and boredom on the station, while Lana questions why they can't create a new replica, discovering that it's impossible without the original body to replicate. Even if they could recreate him, David wouldn't have a reason to return. When Cliff goes back to the station, he's deeply concerned, but apart from speaking less, David doesn't display any other unusual behavior. One morning, Cliff reads in the newspaper that David's family will have a televised funeral, realizing that David will be able to watch it. Alone in the station, David watches the funeral, which exacerbates his depression. As days pass, the combination of isolation and idleness starts to wear on David, and he begins to lose his grip on reality. One afternoon, while fishing with his son, Cliff receives an emergency report about an airlock issue. Upon reaching the station, he discovers David locked in a room, seemingly in a trance-like state, as if he's attempting to sabotage the mission or even end his own life. Cliff forces the door open and checks on his friend, but David claims to be fine. Upon returning to Earth, Cliff confides his concerns in Lana. He worries that if David does something to jeopardize the mission, it could have dire consequences for both of them, potentially even resulting in their deaths. Lana suggests that Cliff allow David to use his link for just an hour, granting him a respite from the isolation and a breath of fresh air, all without Henry's knowledge. Later, Cliff returns to the station and, while going through routine checks, offers David the use of his link. David eagerly accepts, but before doing so, Cliff informs Lana that David will be coming and requests her kindness. Afterward, Cliff uses his tag to send David to his replica. Back on Earth, David takes a moment to adjust to his new body. Lana warmly welcomes him and takes him for a walk in the forest, sharing her favorite spot near a massive tree. David soaks in the sights and sounds, marveling at the insects, the air, and even the sensation of leaves. It all becomes overwhelming, and he ends up shedding tears, finding solace in Lana's comforting embrace. Upon their return, David takes a close look at the house while Henry observes from inside. Upon his return to the spaceship, David expresses his gratitude to Cliff for the experience. While Cliff heads home, David begins to feel somewhat better, and his creative inspiration rekindles, motivating him to start sketching again. A few days pass, and when Cliff returns to the station, David shows him a drawing he made of the house, impressing Cliff with its accuracy, especially considering David was working from memory. David suggests that if the family buys some art supplies, he could create a complete painting as a thank you gift. Of course, he understands if Cliff is hesitant to share the link again. Cliff promises to think about it and discusses the details with Lana, assuring her it would only be an hour once a week. Initially hesitant, Lana eventually agrees, recognizing that painting could serve as the therapy David needs. The next time David awakens on Earth, Lana has set up a complete art studio in the barn, complete with a record player. David notices a sci-fi book, and they engage in a chat about the genre before Lana leaves him to work in solitude. For the first time in a while, Lana feels like she's had a meaningful conversation. Days go by with the two astronauts sharing the link as they agreed, and it's clear that painting is having a positive impact on David. Initially, Lana gives him space, but gradually, they talk more and grow closer. She spends time in the barn while he paints. One day, David brings Lana closer to teach her how to make a stroke on the painting, and Lana is touched by the fact that her husband is being affectionate with her again. When David is alone in the station, he starts spending his time drawing portraits of Lana. Eventually, he convinces Lana to accompany him to the hardware store to buy oil for the paintings. While Lana is purchasing the oil, David steps out of the car and enjoys the feeling of being in a town again. Upon her return, he takes her to the bookstore and buys his favorite sci-fi book for her. An awkward moment arises when the cashier recognizes him, and he pretends to be Cliff, but Lana ends the conversation when the cashier brings up David's tragedy. Back in the car, Lana's hand rests on David's shoulder to comfort him, and she doesn't pull away when he covers it with his own. Later that evening, David returns to the station more inspired than ever, while Lana can't stop thinking about the warmth of his touch. During his next visit, David finally completes the painting by drawing Lana on the pad, which Lana finds flattering. He then asks her to dance with him in celebration, but during the dance, his hands become too forward. Lana pushes him away and runs into the house, unaware that Henry has been observing from outside. David follows Lana and suggests she wants him based on how she looks at him, but Lana firmly reminds him that she sees her husband in him, not a romantic interest. Heartbroken, David returns to the barn to discover the painting has been ruined. Henry is there with paint on his hand, prompting David to strike him. The boy runs into the house, and when Lana learns what happened, she tells David he must leave. When David awakens in the station, he chooses not to tell Cliff what transpired. Cliff returns to Earth and argues with Lana, who is upset because a stranger struck Henry. Cliff, however, doesn't see the problem, as he's done the same in the past. He believes David needs closure, so he convinces Lana to allow one last visit to finish the painting. The next time David returns to Earth, Lana departs with Henry, leaving David to work alone. In the station, Cliff discovers that the treadmill isn't working. So he explores David's room and comes across drawings of Lana without clothes among the usual ones. David notices an alert on his watch and returns to the station, finding Cliff demanding an explanation for the drawings. David attempts to explain that it's merely a fantasy, but when Cliff still hits him, David expresses that he has everything but Cliff doesn't care, leaving Cliff deep in thought. Back on Earth, Lana waits in the car with Henry until she knows Cliff will return. Cliff connects to his replica and promptly destroys the painting in the barn before engaging in a heated argument with his wife. Lana swears she didn't engage in anything with David but admits to having warm reactions, attributing them to her loneliness and boredom. Realizing he hasn't been attentive to his wife's needs, Cliff hugs her and apologizes. On his next visit to the station, David apologizes as well and requests one last visit to Earth to apologize to Lana in person. Enraged, Cliff firmly rejects David's request and fabricates lies about Lana, describing David as disgusting and deceitful. Sometime later, Cliff, determined to be a better husband and father, is on Earth when he receives an alert on his watch. He rushes back to the station, where David informs him that something outside is broken. Once more, Cliff leaves his personal belongings behind, dons his suit, and heads to inspect the station's panels. However, he finds nothing amiss there, and David remains unresponsive through the comms. Anxious, Cliff attempts to return, only to discover the door is locked. Cliff begins to shout, and several minutes pass with no response. Finally, he's allowed back inside, where David claims to have been in the bathroom and that the computer sent a false report. Cliff, sensing something amiss, reaches for his belongings, only to notice his tag is missing. Suddenly, David produces the tag from his pocket, sending Cliff into a state of panic. He seizes the tag and hastily returns to Earth, where he awakens to find his replica covered in blood. Terror-stricken, he investigates further, tracing a trail of bloodstains until he stumbles upon the lifeless bodies of his family. The gruesome discovery shatters him, pushing him into a complete breakdown. Moments later, a deeply disturbed Cliff returns to the spaceship, where David, in a chilling manner, offers him a seat.